The late morning sun over London was weak, doing little to cut through the damp chill that seemed to seep from the ancient cobblestones. Outside St. James's Palace, a crowd 2 or 3 deep had gathered along the black iron railings, a permanent fixture of the city's tourist landscape. They stood with their backs to the traffic on the Mall, smartphones held aloft like modern-day offerings, all hoping to capture the same image, the unwavering stoicism of the King's Guard. Guardsman Liam Walsh, a 24-year-old infantryman from Manchester with the Grenadier Guards, was 2 hours into his 2-hour stint. To the tourists, he was a living prop, a photo opportunity in a scarlet tunic and a towering bearskin cap. To Liam, this was a duty as serious as any he had performed. Before joining the Household Division, he had completed a tour in Cyprus and trained extensively in combat medicine. The palace was not a film set. It was a royal residence, and he was a sentry tasked with its protection. The weight of the SA-80 rifle on his shoulder was not for show. He could hear everything. The whispers of the crowd were a constant, low-level static. He could hear the American accent asking where to get the best photo, the German tourist explaining the history of the Guard to his children, the rustle of a map, the coo of a baby. He could see them all in his peripheral vision, a sea of moving colors against the gray stone. His training dictated that he remain motionless, his eyes focused straight ahead, but his awareness was absolute. He was a statue with the senses of a hawk. Among the throng, a figure began to detach itself from the crowd. And he was a man in his early 50s, dressed in what was clearly expensive casual wear, a crisp, open-collared white linen shirt that looked out of place in the cool weather, tailored beige chinos, and leather loafers that had never seen a drop of rain. On his wrist, a heavy gold watch caught the light. He held a professional-grade camera with a long lens, but he wasn't using it to capture the architecture or the pageantry. He was using it to get as close to Liam's face as possible, the lens practically breaching the invisible barrier of the sentry's personal space. Liam could smell the man's cologne, a sharp, expensive scent that cut through the city air. He could hear the man's breathing, slightly labored from pushing through the crowd. The man circled him slowly, a smirk playing on his lips. He was looking for a reaction, that telltale flicker of the eye or twitch of the mouth that would make his video go viral. "That's it, mate. Just a statue," the man muttered, just loud enough for Liam to hear. He said it to his companion, a woman who hung back looking embarrassed. "Watch this. I'll get him to blink on command." He stepped closer, waving a hand in front of Liam's face. The crowd around them began to take notice, the atmosphere shifting from casual observation to tense anticipation. A few people pulled out their own phones, sensing a scene. Liam felt the familiar surge of adrenaline, the same rush he felt on the training ground. His muscles screamed to move, to step back, to tell this man to give him space, but discipline was a deeper instinct. He thought of his training sergeant, a grizzled veteran with a voice like shattered glass. He who had drilled one thing into them above all else. "You are not a man on that post. You are a symbol. You are the monarchy. You are the regiment. You are Britain. And Britain does not flinch." So he didn't flinch. He stared at the archway of the palace, counting the bricks, reciting the regimental motto, anything to keep his mind from the provocateur circling him like a shark. The man, whose name was Arthur Prescott, was a hedge fund manager from Connecticut. He had made his fortune by being aggressive, by pushing until he got what he wanted, and he saw the world as a series of transactions and challenges. The Guard was simply the latest challenge, a monolithic obstacle to be conquered for entertainment. He had no concept of service, of duty, or of the quiet, immense dignity of the man in front of him. Arthur leaned in close, and his face just inches from Liam's ear. "Are you even real?" he stage whispered, his breath hot against Liam's cheek. "All that money we pay in taxes, and this is what we get? A mannequin with a gun?" The disrespect was staggering. A woman in the crowd gasped. A man with a Union Jack backpack muttered, "Bloody hell, have some respect." Liam heard it all. He felt the phantom twitch in his trigger finger, the primal urge to react. He thought of the punishment for breaking rank, the disgrace it would bring to his regiment. But more than that, he thought of his grandfather, a veteran of the Falklands, who had taught him that real strength was the ability to endure. So he endured. He focused on the sound of the distant traffic, the feel of the rough wool of his tunic against his neck, the precise weight of the rifle in his hands. And he became an island of stillness in a sea of agitation. Arthur, frustrated by the lack of response, decided to up the ante. He stepped back, tucked his expensive camera under his arm, and addressed the crowd loudly. "See? Nothing. They're not soldiers, they're actors. Probably get paid minimum wage to stand around in a costume. My dog has more personality." A few tourists laughed nervously, unsure of how to react. Most just stared, a mixture of disgust and fascination on their faces. The woman with Arthur tugged at his sleeve, hissing, "Arthur, stop it, you're making a scene." "That's the point, honey," he said, shaking her off. "The world is a scene and we're the audience. I'm just trying to get a rise out of the performer." He turned back to Liam. This time, and his actions crossed a line that stunned the onlookers into absolute silence. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a crisp $100 bill. He leaned in, and with a theatrical flourish, he tried to tuck it into the white leather pouch of Liam's belt, as if tipping a bellhop or a street performer. The moment the paper touched the leather of his equipment, something inside Liam snapped. It wasn't the insult to him, but the insult to the uniform. That belt held his bayonet. It was part of his fighting order. Touching a soldier's kit without permission was an act of aggression. The adrenaline that had been building for the last 10 minutes finally found a release valve. With a movement so sharp and sudden it made the front row of the crowd jump back, Liam stamped his right foot on the cobblestone. The crack was like a gunshot, an echoing off the palace walls. The crowd went rigid. Arthur froze. The $100 bill still pinched between his fingers, a look of genuine shock on his face. Then, Liam's voice erupted. It was not the voice of a man, but the voice of the regiment. It was a deep, guttural roar that had been perfected on parade grounds for centuries. "Stand back from the King's Guard!" The command was deafening. It wasn't just loud, it was authoritative. It carried the weight of history, of every soldier who had ever stood on that spot. It was a verbal wall, designed to stop a threat in its tracks. Arthur stumbled backward as if he had been physically pushed, the $100 bill fluttering from his fingers and landing on the wet cobblestones. His face, moments ago a mask of smug superiority, was now pale and slack-jawed. He looked around, unexpecting someone to laugh, to share in his joke. But there were no laughs. Only a profound, heavy silence. In that moment, Arthur looked around and saw, perhaps for the first time in his life, a reflection of himself that wasn't manufactured by his wealth. He saw the disgust on the faces of the British public. He saw the stern, unwavering focus of the armed police officers who had begun to walk purposefully toward the scene. He saw the disdain in the eyes of the other tourists. Most of all, he saw the immovable object he had just tried and failed to topple. Guardsman Walsh stood exactly as he had before, his eyes forward, his breathing even. The outburst was over. He was once again a statue. But the scene was far from over. The shock on Arthur's face was only the beginning of his undoing. The crowd, which had been a passive audience, there was now an active jury. A low murmur began to build, a sound of collective outrage. A man in a flat cap stepped forward and pointed a finger at Arthur. "Who do you think you are?" the man asked, his voice trembling with anger. "That's a soldier. That's one of ours. You don't get to do that." The dam broke. A woman with a pushchair joined in. "Disgraceful! Coming here and treating our boys like that!" A teenager, phone still recording, shouted, "Posting that online, mate. Let's see how clever you look now." Arthur was surrounded, not by a mob, but by the quiet, fierce indignation of people who understood the value of what they had just seen violated. The two armed police officers, who had been watching from the periphery, finally reached him. They were part of the Ministry of Defense Police, a familiar sight at such locations. They were calm, but their presence was an immovable force. "Sir," the older of the two officers said, his voice devoid of emotion, "I need you to collect your property and accompany me." Arthur looked down. The $100 bill was lying in a puddle, the portrait of Benjamin Franklin soaking up the dirty water. He bent to pick it up, but the officer gently placed a hand on his arm. "Leave it," the officer said. It wasn't a request. The crowd parted silently as Arthur and the woman were led away from the railings. There were no cheers, just a deep, resonant silence that was more powerful than any applause. It was the silence of justice served. As they disappeared around the corner, the focus returned to Guardsman Walsh. He stood precisely as he had been. His face was impassive, his eyes fixed on the middle distance. But if one looked closely, they might have seen the faintest, almost imperceptible rise of his chest as he took a deep, steadying breath. The storm had passed, and he was still standing. The crowd, now chastened and respectful, began to disperse quietly. Some offered a small nod in the guard's direction before they left. They had come to see a spectacle, and they had witnessed something far more profound, the triumph of discipline over chaos, of duty over ego. The air around the palace felt cleaner somehow, as if the ugly incident had been washed away by the sheer force of the guard's composure. The tourists who remained now stood a few steps further back, their cameras held a little lower, their voices reduced to respectful whispers. They had learned a lesson without a single word being spoken to them directly. They had seen the line, and they now knew not to cross it. For Liam, the final 30 minutes of his duty passed in a blur of controlled focus. When the relief guard finally marched into view, the precision of their drill a comforting ritual, he felt a wave of exhaustion wash over him. The handover was silent and flawless. As he fell into step to march away, he did not look at the crowd. He did not look for Arthur. He simply walked, his eyes forward, his body aching with the tension of the last 2 hours. Back in the guard room, the atmosphere was thick with unspoken words. His fellow guardsmen looked at him with a new level of respect. They had heard the roar, and they had seen the aftermath from a distance. The sergeant major, a man with a chest full of medals and a face like granite, walked over to Liam. He stood in front of him for a long moment, and then simply nodded. "Well done, son," he said, his voice low and gruff. "You did the regiment proud today." It was the highest praise Liam could have asked for. He nodded back, not trusting his voice. He sat on a wooden bench and finally allowed himself to replay the events in his mind. He thought about the man's face, the shock, the humiliation. He felt no satisfaction, only a quiet sense of a job done right. Meanwhile, miles away in a posh hotel bar near Park Lane, Arthur Prescott sat with a double whiskey, staring at his phone. The video was everywhere. It was on Twitter, on TikTok, on the evening news websites. The comments were a global chorus of condemnation. He had achieved the viral fame he craved, but it was a poison chalice. His face was now synonymous with the ugly American abroad. and his business partners had sent terse messages. His phone buzzed